Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Thea Wieseltier, the Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of JTA, and the curator of tonight's program. Before we begin, I want to offer a thought about our sorrow. It is important for us to understand that other people, even our friends and our allies, will never completely understand the depth of our pain, just as we will never completely understand the deep pain of others who have experienced atrocities. The reason for this is not prejudice, though such prejudices certainly exist. The reason is that October 7, before it was an event in history, was an event in our family, the large and quarrelsome family that we called the Jewish people. This was the first and foremost a family tragedy, a family wound, and our sorrow is a familial sorrow. Only after we recognize this intimate dimension of October 7 can we move on to larger historical and strategic and political analysis. And that is what we will endeavor to do this evening, to make space for our familial grief. And now, our program this evening is brought to you in partnership with the National Library of Israel and NLI USA, the library's affiliate in the US. We are proud to have forged this special partnership. I also want to thank the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University for co-sponsoring this program. I am now delighted to turn to Adina Canefield, the CEO of NLI USA, to share introductory remarks and introduce our moderator.
The National Library of Israel holds the collective memory of the Jewish people. We strive to bring strength in this time of war as we carry out our work documenting and preserving history, both in times of celebration and now in times of great challenge. The library literally holds the stories of our people. Today's program is an opportunity to come together to hear from important voices in our collective story. Our partnership with JTA today and so many other organizations over the years and hopefully in years to come represents our commitment to extending the National Library of Israel's mission to the broader community around the world. We are so proud to join in bringing you this program today. I'll now turn to Ben Harris, our moderator this evening. Ben is the managing editor of My Jewish Learning, the Jewish learning platform for 70 Faces Media. Ben spent many years as a reporter and editor at the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and I know that he will engage this esteemed group of authors in a thoughtful and meaningful conversation. Ben?
Thank you so much, Adina, and thank you, Thea, for putting this event together this evening. Friends, in a few weeks, the State of Israel and Jews around the world will mark the first anniversary of one of the darkest days in our modern history. The events of October 7th were an unspeakable tragedy for the more than 1,200 Israelis that were killed or taken hostage and their families. But its consequences run much deeper, launching the country into a difficult and ongoing war and inaugurating what some believe is the most perilous moment in its history. As we gather here today, dozens of hostages are still held in Gaza. Thousands of Israelis are still displaced from their homes, including one of our panelists this evening. And the Israeli military continues to wage a difficult and grinding campaign in Gaza. Anniversaries are moments for honoring the past, and we will certainly be making space for doing that this evening. But they are also moments for making meaning out of the past for both the present and the future. And that is a challenging thing to do at this time, both because of the sheer magnitude of what unfolded on the 7th of October, and because we are still very much living in its shadow. For the Israelis who have been directly touched by this, it is still very much October 7th. To help us think through some of these challenges we are facing as we prepare to mark this first anniversary, we are joined this evening by two reporters for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Amir Tibon is a diplomatic correspondent for the paper, and if his name is familiar to you, it's probably because he was the subject of a dramatic rescue from his home in Kibbutz Nahal Oz on October 7th by his father, a retired major general in the Israel Defense Forces. The story of that rescue is the subject of Amir's new book, The Gates of Gaza, which, alongside his own amazing story of survival, also tells the story of the kibbutz near the Gaza border, where he and his wife chose to live and raise their two daughters. Also joining us this evening is Yaron, an investigative reporter at Haaretz who has covered social welfare issues and climate change for the paper. She is also a theater director and a playwright, and the author of the forthcoming book, 10/7-100 Human Stories, a deeply reported and moving account of the events of October 7th as told through the experiences of the people who lived it. We are also joined this evening by historian Ilan Troen. Ilan is the author of the recent book, Israel-Palestine in World Religions, Whose Promised Land?, which attempts to trace the entangled secular and religious narratives that undergird the struggle for sovereignty and security in Israel and Palestine. Ilan was also touched in the most terrible of ways by the events of October 7th when his daughter Shachar and his son-in-law Shlomi were killed in their home in Kibbutz Cholit while shielding their son Rotem. Rotem sustained a gunshot wound but survived. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Amir, I would like to start with you. The story of what your family experienced on October 7th has been told many times, and for readers who want the full story, your book offers a dramatic account of that day. But October 7th has not really ended for your family, which has been unable to return to the kibbutz that was your home, which is also the case for many of your friends and neighbors who are still displaced. I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit about how your family is doing and what the last year has been like for you. I think you are on mute, Amir.
Yes, absolutely. And before that, I just want to say it's a great honor to be sharing this webinar today with Ilan and Lee. And I look forward to hearing from them as well. And thank you to everyone who joined. I think this is a very important conversation. My family and my community, we are part of a larger story in this country right now, in which tens of thousands of people have been displaced from their homes for a year almost now. We're talking about communities on the Israeli border with Gaza that were evacuated in the aftermath of the massacre of October 7, including my kibbutz, Nahal Oz, small community of 450 people living 800 meters from Gaza City border, and more than 24 other communities along the border, some of which had since returned, the ones that are a little more further away into Israel, but some who are still de facto refugees in our own country. And then on top of that, communities on the northern border, communities that are located next to the Lebanese border and have been evacuated since October 8th, some of them with not even waiting for an official decree from the government, but basically on October 7, when they saw what was happening in Nahal Oz and in Cholit and in all these other places we're going to discuss today, they said we could be next, and they just got up and left. And right now, both for communities like Nahal Oz and for communities like Kibbutz Manara on the border with Lebanon, there is no timeline for returning home. Specifically in my community, today there are about 20 people living in the kibbutz, and that's a new development. Until a few weeks ago, we did not even have that. But we do have about 20 people who have come back to live in the kibbutz. We're not talking here about families with young children. We're talking mostly about people whose children have already grown older or younger people who don't have children yet. It's still not a place where you can bring your family back. The homes look the same way that we left them on October 7. My house, 30-something bullet marks, broken windows, grenades that were thrown on the walls. The state is not functioning in this part of Israel. You don't have a kindergarten. You don't have a train service to Tel Aviv. You don't have a lot of normal examples of life that is needed. And how do you deal with it as a family, as a community? Day by day. I do want to say that I'm very grateful to our host community, Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek, near Haifa, and I'm joining you today or tonight here in Israel from the library of Mishmar HaEmek. They've been hosting us with great generosity, and if I have to sum it up in one sentence, what we have learned since October 7, we've seen the Israeli government completely dysfunction. The government has been uninvolved in the plight of communities like Nishal Oz. But at the same time, we have seen the incredible generosity and strength of many parts of Israeli society, like this kibbutz that has been hosting us since October 8th.
Thank you. Lee, unlike Amir, the subjects of your book are mostly unknown to the public, at least outside of Israel. And if I could just say personally, your book was incredibly difficult to read. It was deeply reported and moving account. And you're reading these 100 stories, and each one begins with the story of a person that you know by the end of the chapter something tragic is going to happen to them. But I think it will emerge in all likelihood as one of the definitive accounts of what unfolded on that day. I wonder if you could share one or two of the stories from that book for those people who haven't had attention drawn to their story. What can you tell us? You are also muted. There you go.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for this introduction, and it's great to be here with Amir and Ilan. You know, the scale of this massacre was clear to me from the beginning that it wasn't that my book and my work will not be only about Israeli history, but it will be about Jewish history. And when the news were unfolding, I knew I will do the deep work of connecting this day to the wider context. I personally come from a family of people who came to Israel to flee Jewish suffering, that were hoping that Israel will be the end of Jewish history in that sense, in the way they knew it, and that their families could begin a new, safe chapter in Israel. From my mother's side, we come from Portugal, and until this day, our surname is Adato, which is in Hebrew Gematria is 1496, and it's the year the Jews of Portugal and my family were expelled from their homes. For 500 years, we kept this name of the year of our deportation, so every generation would remember the injustice that was done to them. From my father's side were Jews from Russia and Romania who survived pogroms and the Holocaust. So both sides of my family, people that came to Israel in an older age, were struggling with culture and with language, working in a minimum wage jobs. But they believed that their sacrifice would be worth it for their kids and their grandchildren. And when that fence broke on 10/7, and their dream was broken too. And that's exactly what I heard from all of these interviews with really hundreds of people from so many different sectors of the Israeli society, people who fled Arab countries in the 50s and people who fled the former Soviet Union and Europe. They are the families of the victims of 10/7. And when you speak with them, you see not only the pain of this day, but the pain of this dream of generations broken. For example, there's the story of Shachar Tzemach. There was a peace activist from Be'eri, a volunteer for breaking the silence, and he was defending the clinic where the doctors and paramedics tried to take care of the injured of Be'eri when Hamas terrorists shot him. And in his last moments, he was putting his hands up and he was saying, "I'm not your enemy, please." And when I was speaking with his parents, I came to understand that for them, it wasn't just Shahar, because Shahar's grandmother, Carmela, was a young girl in Baghdad when she survived the Farhud pogrom in 41, when 200 of her neighbors were murdered by their Arab neighbors. And Carmela came to Israel and was building the kibbutzim with other people because they had no choice. And then I'm thinking about the latest example of Jews running away to Israel that everyone are overlooking, and that's the example of the 50,000 Ukrainian refugees that came to Israel since February of 2022 under the law of return that grants every Jew the right to immigrate to Israel, and are victims of these two wars. I tell in the book the story of Eitan, a 15-year-old boy from Odessa. He was 6 when his mother gave him and his brother to a Jewish orphanage because she couldn't afford to raise them like many others families in Ukraine of that time. And he grew up there and he had good life with warm clothes and 3 meals a day and friends. But on the morning of February 24th of 2002, he needed to flee with the rest of the kids and began a long journey that ended up in Israel, in Ashkelon, which is a southern city, whereas a large community of Ukrainian Jews that love the beach that reminds them of the beach of Odessa, of this white sand. And on 10/7, a Hamas missile hit Eitan's home directly. He luckily survived, but this kid needed to start his life again for the 3rd time in 2 years. And he asked me this question that I think about a lot these days. He was asking, well, I'm 15, I've been through 2 wars. Where do you think there is a safe place for a Jewish kid to live these days?
Ilan, your daughter and son-in-law were both musicians. They were music teachers, and they chose to live in a kibbutz very close to Gaza. Tell us, if you would, a little bit about her story and about what unfolded for them on 10/7.
Thank you. Let me follow on what has been said. One of the terrible ironies of Jewish history is that my daughter is buried about 100 meters from my mother. My mother grew up in the Ukraine, came to America as a result of the pogroms of 1919, and she was saved by her mother, who rescued her from Petlura and what we used to call his banditim, who engaged in the greatest pogroms before the Holocaust. Who would have imagined that my mother's granddaughter would save her son by a miraculous and lucky means from another pogrom, and that's what October 7th was. It was not a war, it was not a military action. It was an action against civilians whose crime was having an identity different than that of the attackers. And I begin there because I grew up in the United States. I now live 45 seconds from the Gaza border by missile. And we came here to this part of the country by design, for we wanted to make the desert bloom, although I do it as an academic in a different way than my friends on the kibbutzim do it. But there are many ways to make the desert bloom. But I grew up believing never again. So I have to live through the notion that never again may never again be said, certainly not for me, for my generation, and for the generation of my children. That's a terrible kind of awakening, totally unexpected, because as Leah just said, Israel was supposed to be a safe place for Jews. We knew about the risks. We know about army service. We all serve. We all have stories within our family and our community. But this kind of story of a pogrom taking place amongst those of us who have come to Israel is something totally unexpected and outrageous.
Lee, I'll come back to you because what unfolded at Kibbutz Cholit, where Shachar and Shlomi made their home, is one of the chapters that you tell in the book, and just listening to you all is sort of flashbacky for me to that morning itself, and I feel a lot of the same emotions coming up as I hear these stories as I did in those first days and weeks after the attack. And I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about what it was like for you to immerse yourself in these stories for so many months. I mean, this was a really deeply reported book, and interviewing so many survivors and telling their tales. What kind of effect did that have on you?
I'm very lucky, and I know that, and I feel like all Israelis that are not directly affected. I mean, I lost a very dear friend of mine, but I was lucky not to lose my family in Ofakim that were hiding this day. Maybe I'll tell a little bit about their story too. But I feel this, survivor's guilt that every Israeli feel. And writing this book, I mean, I started writing it in the end of October, and it was just I felt like I needed to do something for these victims, that their lives were stolen from them in this horrible way, that at least to ask for their forgiveness. And there's not much you can do for the dead. So the only thing I felt like I could do for them, the only justice I could give them, was to tell their stories. And to tell their stories not merely as victims, not to remember them just for their last moments, but to really look at their lives, their beliefs, their communities, their family histories, to remember them for the humans they were. And I think the process of being, interviewing all of this, really hundreds of people that went through their hardest days, was, on the one hand, it was traumatic, and it's affecting me. I'm not the same person. I can't sleep well since then. But it also gave me strength to learn from them, from the stories, from people that have went through the most horrible things and are still trying and fighting for our country. So many people from this peace community that were doing everything they can to promote Palestinian statehood, that were donating kibbutz Be'eri, for example, that 1 of 10 of his residents were murdered or killed, or donating every month for almost 20 years money to families in Gaza, or driving Palestinian kids to these hospitals. A lot of these families are still fighting now for a two-state solution, making conversations with our neighbors from the other side, saying the fact that that happened to us, we don't want revenge. And then you hear also the other side, families that say, we believed we not only lost our loved ones, but we lost everything we believed in, because we feel like fools to ever believe in coexistence. So you see, and I'm in a position of just learning from these people and being in awe, and trying to do what I promised them, is to make their children and their parents remembered for who they were, and not just as political symbols of a war that politicians are using for their own needs.
Amir, you also wrote a book, and your book is actually about people who were your friends and neighbors, the people who lived with you on the kibbutz that you knew quite intimately. Did you have a similar experience as you were writing your book? Was there a sense of duty? Was there a sense of catharsis in working on this?
Yeah, I find myself nodding because I share a lot of what Lee said about the process of writing. In my kibbutz, Nachal Oz, 15 people were murdered on October 7. In the military base next to the kibbutz, more than 50 soldiers were killed in the battles that ensued there, and some of them really in a massacre. We're talking about female soldiers, intelligence soldiers who did not have weapons to defend themselves. 4 other fighters from Israeli special units died in an attempt to reach our community and to save people within it. One of them died on my doorstep in the morning hours of October 6th. If my house, if I would locate it here on a map, a neighbor was killed in the house in front of me, and another neighbor was murdered in the house behind. How do you put so many names, so many stories into one book, which is basically built around a plot line? It has to move forward. That was a major challenge. And I decided that I'm going to write about each and every one of the members of the community who were murdered on that day. Some of them who were closer to me, more at length, and others less, but I'm going to mention each and every one. I decided that I'm going to write about 4 soldiers whose stories intersect with mine in different ways. I could not go into the stories of the 50 plus soldiers who died in the base 5 minutes from my home. And I think a different book will have to be written about what happened at the Nachal Oz base. It deserves a book of its own. This was the base where we lost the highest number of soldiers on October 7. So it was a challenge to try to decide what to include and then how to memorize the people. And for me, part of the mission, and this connects to what Lee said before, is that I wanted to tell about these people not only in the context of October 7, because my book also tells the story of Kibbutz Nachal Oz from its foundation in October 1953 until its destruction in October 2023. The book has 2 timelines that move in parallel. There's the timeline of October 7 that begins at 6:29 a.m. when the first mortar explodes on our neighborhood. And there's the timeline of the history of the community that goes back to 1953 and is also built around people in the community. And for me, that was very important because all of these places, Nachal Oz and Cholit and Be'eri and Sderot, they were not created on October 7. These places had decades of history before that terrible day, and I feel that they will only be associated moving forward with the massacre of October 7. And so part of my mission was to also write about the history and the people who were murdered on that day and the lives that they lived in this border community before October 7.
Ilan, your book is not about October. It's a work of history, but it came out a few months after October 7th, and in the wake of the massacre, you elected to make some changes to the introduction and to other parts of the book. Could you tell us what you changed and what motivated you to do so?
Yes, and it relates to what has been said. I think that people who lived in the kibbutzim that we're talking about were optimists. Not only at Be'eri, but throughout the whole Gaza envelope, there were people who believed that peace was possible. Otherwise, why live there? There were people who could have chosen to move to the territories. They did not, and that was a conscious action. My children and my grandchildren were among the founders of Hagar, which is a multicultural, multi-language school for Arab and Jews, believed that understanding was possible. So that gets to the issue of how do we think about October 7th? Is this a one-off or is this characteristic? How do we look at any event in the century of conflict, which begins, as we've been told, that you don't begin this year, you begin 40 years back, 100 years back, with the beginning of the kibbutz movement. What did Zionists anticipate would take place? Did we believe that we could actually come and live in this land and live with peaceful relations with our neighbors? Or we were to forever condemned to live in a battle mode and to suffer the risks of engaging in warfare? And so it was framing that possibilities within the context that history, at least for me, is not deterministic. that choices were made from the beginning. And I'll say it straight out, whether it's acceptable to all the listeners or not, but a Chaim Weizmann and a Jabotinsky and a Ben-Gurion would not engage in the kind of rhetoric that sees the people amongst whom we live, all of them, as enemies. I'm often asked, well, how do you relate to Arabs? How do your children relate to Arabs? My kids and my grandchildren want to go back. They want to keep trying. They think that the state of Israel still has a future in the part of the Middle East, and not only is a bastion barricaded by warfare, that there is a possibility of creating amicable relations. And much of my book tells the story of how through theological discourses and through secular law and international law, the battle over the legitimacy of a Jewish state has been fought, and that there has never been a deterministic single possibility for the outcome, that this is a constant struggle, and that how miraculous it was that when a Christian empire, the British Empire, after 1,300 years of Muslim rules, said this country is going to be transformed into the Jewish national home. One can find, and I'm not going to do the book now, so relax, but one can find changes within Catholicism, within Protestantism, even within Islam, and within Judaism, about what the meaning and possibilities of a Jewish state might be. I don't think that October 7th is a historic necessity, that it has to return again and again and again, and that we are consigned to that future. So what I've tried to offer is an openness, is to consider that we have always lived through historic junctions where people have made choices this way and that way, and those choices have deeply informed what the outcomes would be. And the people have made choices of both Jews and Arabs, both Gentiles, Christians, Muslims, and Jews have considered and reconsidered what the fate of this land that all of us considered holy and entrusted to us might be. And that's what I want my readers to consider, is that it's not closed, it's still open, it was open, and that much good and much has been accomplished over the last century. And what the second century or the next century will be is still an open issue.
I'd like to go back to something that Amir mentioned at the beginning, the sense that the state has been MIA. The Israelis who were displaced from their homes, because I think one of the things which was broken on October 7th was also a deep sense of trust that Israelis had in their government, in their military, in the security services, to keep them safe, and perhaps, as Lee, you alluded to as well, perhaps in the very nature of the Zionist project itself. And I'm wondering what it would take to recover that. Like, how does one come back from that? Ilan, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I would say that what has to be done is honesty. I think that we have to honestly confront what took place, why it took place. And that means it's that Hamas is absolutely responsible for what took place. But we also took actions or did not take actions for which we are responsible. I'm very much concerned. We're coming up to the anniversary, and we're all flooded, those of us who are here, and maybe those of us who are not here, with a multitude of events to commemorate and memorialize what took place. And it behooves us to try to treat what took place honestly. That was done in the past. We did that after 73, when there was another disaster. Are we in Israel capable of investigating ourselves and fully exploring what went wrong? I don't need to inquire into Hamas. I understand Hamas's sinful, outrageous, terrible behavior. But I do want to understand why it is that we were so unprepared as we were, why those young women on that base next to you, Amir, were slaughtered when they were giving warnings. What was wrong within our system? And did it have to turn out this way? Because there are larger forces that one can talk about: theological hate, senses of the illegitimacy of a Jewish state. But there are things that we have done right in the past. Why didn't we do them again on October 6th, 5th, 4th, and before? One last word. I can remember Gaza under a very different circumstance, not as a soldier, but where we at Ben Gurion University, we had seminars on our campus on medicine, on language teaching. Fathi Arafat, Yasser Arafat's brother, has joint publications with our faculty on the ecology that all of us share in the Negev. Is there not a possibility for recovering that? Is there not a possibility for ensuring that that continues? What do they have to do? What do we have to do, both on a political way, but also on the most fundamental military way? We have F-35s and all kinds of technical means, but the human word and human intelligence seems to have been ignored. There are things that have to be probed. The generals, and most of all the prime minister, has to take responsibility. Why were there not more soldiers along the Gaza envelope? Why was a brigade put into the territories rather than stay around the Gaza envelope when the warnings were being raised? Those are the kinds of things that have to be done. And if we can't face our present and our recent past honestly, then we are severely limited in how we can approach our future.
Lee, do you want to jump in here? Is the road back to public trust run through investigations and an honest accounting here?
Yeah, I mean, I think about the way October 7th and the mistrust changed Israel, what Israelis think about the future. I mean, so many Israelis have turned to the right wing after this loss of confidence and the massacre and the world's reaction. The support we have now for a two-state solution is really at the all-time low. It was 60% a decade ago. It was 50% just before the war. And now when you look at the numbers, it's about 35 to 25% of the Israelis that still believe. And we need to think about that. This kibbutzim, we spoke about it a bit before, 94% of them were voting for the left wing and centrist parties. If the Israelis' election were decided by the kibbutzim then on this border, Netanyahu was not only not the prime minister, the Likud party wasn't even in the Knesset. And I believe that his 17 years in power, the 17 years that Netanyahu have told all Israelis that we need to prefer the military solution on a solution of diplomacy, that we can't solve this conflict and we need to manage it all the time, is the strategy that led us to the war and need to be changed. You know, I come from a generation that is 50% of the Israelis that are 30 years old or younger. That means that we were born just as Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by a Jewish extremist. And with him, the dream of the Oslo Accords, the young people that are fighting this war never lived in a time where there were real hope for peace. And in Gaza, it's the same, even more than half of the population is under 18. And I'm thinking about 1996 election and Netanyahu having his campaign, Netanyahu, Sim Shalom Batuach, or Netanyahu making peace with safety, and the debate that looked to me imaginable about how to make peace, not whether to make it or not. And I see all my friends now in the streets. I see hundreds of thousands of Israelis that are understanding that this military approach endangers the hostages. The diplomacy and a deal could give them life and can be a better option. And I hope Israelis can see that it's not only true for the hostages, but it's true for the entire conflict, that if we want to recover the trust, if we want to live a safe life, the only thing that proved himself is the peace agreements we have with Egypt from 79 and with Jordan since 94. It works, it's stable, and we need to do everything we can to have an agreement like that with the Palestinians so we can end this cycle and live the safe life our grandfathers and mothers hoped for.
Amir, I'm really curious to get your take on this. I mean, your community, as has been mentioned many times, was among the most peace-loving, liberal, left-leaning, coexistence-minded places in all of Israel. What has been the effect of the last year on their politics? Is this still a community that believes in coexistence and two states, or has this hardened them?
I think in general, what we're seeing today in Israel politically is a very interesting situation. There has been a shift toward the right in terms of how people view the conflict. People don't believe in peace. People don't believe in coexistence. And this, in a way, is a natural response to what happened. It's a natural human response to being attacked like this and to such a massacre. But at the same time, the right-wing parties that are making up the current government are collapsing in polls. They are losing a lot of support. Even in the most optimistic polls for them, which are run by partisan pollsters loyal to the government, they are not winning a majority. So what's happening here? If the public is shifting toward the right, why are the right-wing parties losing support? And I think one of the reasons for that is that people understand that whether you are right-wing or left-wing, and no matter what your opinions are about the conflict, and honestly, right now, everybody's opinion is shifting. Things are moving at a very fast pace. But regardless of where you stand, everybody admits, except for, the very, very, very hardcore elements of supporting this government, which are far from a majority of Israeli society, everybody admits that this is the worst government in the history of Israel. A government that is basically bringing about the destruction of Zionism. The places that have been evacuated since October 7, whether it's Nachal Oz and Polit and Be'eri in the south, or Kiryat Shmona and Manara in the north, are the epitome of Zionism. These are places that were built over decades. People invested blood and sweat, and the state of Israel invested great resources in building these places out of a belief first articulated by the founding generation of Israeli leaders, Ben-Gurion, Dayan, and others, of the importance of living along the borders of the state of Israel, of maintaining communities on these borders, of marking the place where the state of Israel begins and ends. This was the most important mission of the Zionist movement. And all of these places that were created and maintained and expanded and strengthened over decades of hard work from so many people, all of them were destroyed under the watch of this failed government. And if we talk about an investigation, Ben, it's important to understand right now, the people blocking an investigation into the failures of October 7 are the people in government. This is like the Bush administration in the US blocking an investigation of 9/11. I remember when the 9/11 Commission in the US published its report, which was, taller than me. It was this gigantic document. Right now, we have a government that oversaw our 9/11, the one day in which more Israelis were murdered, more Jews were murdered than any other day since the Holocaust. And they are blocking a true investigation of it because they know the investigation will come back to them. Now, it's not all simply on the government. I have a great crisis of trust with the military. I think all the military leadership must resign. The intelligence agencies failed us completely. I served in Unit 8200 of the intelligence, which had this great reputation once. And after the book Startup Nation was published, everybody wanted to say they served there. Today, I'm ashamed to say that I was part of that unit. Ashamed. This unit failed the people of Israel. But at least the leaders of the military have a little bit of an understanding of the magnitude of the failure and a realization that their public career is over. Some of them say they want to stick around until the end of the war. Others are already putting down the ranks, and we are never going to hear from them. I don't want them to go to jail. I, God forbid, don't want them to commit suicide. But we don't want to hear from them ever again. They should retire and go do something to help all the people like Ilan who lost their loved ones on that day. The politicians in the government, they are not even in that stage of realizing that they failed us. What they're doing is trying to stick to their chairs, very comfortable chairs, and to their salaries and to their drivers, and refusing to even accept their responsibility for what happened. So this is a very big problem, and it's separate from the very important discussion about the future of Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians and peace, which we need to have as a society. And maybe right now is not the best time to have it because everybody's emotions are very, very impacted by what happened. But, you know, the last line I want to say, we need to talk about the two-state solution, but if this government continues to lead us, we are heading toward the zero-state solution because they are dismantling the state of Israel.
I'd like
For
to
the
turn,
three-state solution. One of them.
I'd like to turn in our last couple of minutes together to the question of memory, which I noted at the outset is challenging because we're still clearly, as I think we've seen in the last 45 minutes, emotions are still high, and we don't have the distance or the long lens of history to know exactly what the significance of this event is over the long term. And I wonder, Ilan, maybe you can kick us off here as the historian among us. Maybe you can speak to this. I know you've been in conversations with other bereaved families about how to memorialize October 7th. And I'm wondering what you can tell us about those conversations and about how we might think about this question more broadly.
Let me tell you about one set of conversations, then relate as a historian to the general topic. As bereaved parents, the state of Israel may not be rebuilding the communities as it should, but it supports psychological help for people who have lost loved ones. And we're part of a group of parents who have lost their children. We're the oldest members of a group of people from this area. Everybody else lost children at the rock party at Re'im. And we're different. We're different because our child was 50 and already had 3 children, teenagers and even beyond. They are left with an empty room, full of mementos, full of the promise of life that they will never see. They are far more devastated than we are because that emptiness and that lack of future for people that they loved is so painful that it causes dysfunction. We are blessed with 3 children, teenagers, young adults who are going forth in life and who actually dream of going back to a kibbutz like Cholit, who were imbued with hope and the tradition of their parents and wish to continue. What I'm trying to say is that it's all individual, and that's the way it has to be because there are 3 different levels of memorialization. One is the individual, one's own personal situation. We all phrase our own gravestones, tombstones, and one can analyze this problem by what people put on tombstones, and I'll come back to that in a second. Then there are communal, the village you live to, the work group you belong to, the school that your children went to, the army unit, and then there's the national memorialization. The most difficult is the national memorialization, and about that there's a fight raging in Israel now. Do we allow this government to create the memory for what took place for an event for which they are unwilling to confront its origins, and who's responsible for it. But on a private level, on a communal level, this goes on all around us. We are all enmeshed. You cannot believe the number of events that we go to and the amount of memorials that are taking place and the variety. But even there are some interesting decisions that have to be made. One is, what do you put on a gravestone? Everybody puts on Tet Nun Sadi Bethe. May the soul of this person be bound up with the soul of the living. Everybody writes the child of so-and-so, the loving husband, the brother, the this, the that, or the other, the personal. One of the crucial issues is, do you put on Hey Yud Dalet? Do you put on May God avenge this event? We as a family did not. There was only one member of a very large family who said, that is what we put on. And the reason is that we did not believe that God was implicit or complicit in what took place on October 7th, and we're certainly not going to rely upon God to mete out justice in the sweet by and by or the near future to those who perpetrated this terrible event. What I'm trying to suggest is that there are personal levels, and each family decides how they remember their loved ones. There'd be an interesting book on the speeches, the eulogies that are made, what is common and what is distinctive. This is soul-tearing literature that gets to the soul of who is here, why we're here, what we've done here, what we hope for this place. And then you go up the ladder to the national, and that's where it begins to fall apart. It will take us some time to figure out how to do this. It took more than 20 years to figure out how to relate to the Shoah. The Shoah was first on a collective basis remembered as a day of bravery and heroism. It took till after the Eichmann trial in the 70s to appreciate the stories of the individuals who suffered through that event. So there'll be a process. And we're the first generation that will deal with it. And we'll probably deal with it successfully as we tie in the memories of those who are lost with the souls of the living and all the myriad of ways that we as individuals have in remembering the people that we loved and went to deaths that are so brutal and unnecessary.
Lee, do you want to jump in here? How should Israel be thinking about this anniversary?
Yeah, Ilan was saying very, very strong things, and maybe I'll relate to that from Ilan. I wrote a chapter about Kibbutz Cholit, and I mentioned your family there and how amazing they were, and I write it from the perspective of their neighbor. I don't know if you know them, Moshe Riedler. Moshe Riedler was a Holocaust survivor. He was the only Holocaust survivor that was murdered on 10/7 and the oldest victim of this attack. But I started this chapter when Moshe is 13. And on the day of Simchat Torah, 1941, Moshe lives with his family in a little town named Herza on the border between Romania and Ukraine. And when the Romanian allies of the Nazis go to his town, they start by deporting the richest Jews, and then they go to Moshe's house and send all of his family to the ghetto, where his family is murdered and Moshe is separated from them. And then he comes to Israel after a long journey and begins a new life. And I spoke with his family about how he used to commemorate the Holocaust and how he would react to this kind of day and what he'd been through. And they always said his way was building his family, his life. He became a cop in Israel, a very dedicated, passionate cop that was famous in the newspapers of the 60s, going after drug dealers. And he moved to Cholet in the end of his life with all of these young people like Ilan's family that were so motivated to build the kibbutzim again, because Cholet was a small kibbutz, and to bring new blood, new ambition. He was like their grandfather. so I think about him and his legacy, and the fact that we need, I think gatherings like the one we're doing now is the best commemoration we can do. People from so many places, people that are not living in Israel, are now taking the time, taking the effort to listen to us, to listen to the stories, to remember them. It's like we're part of this old tradition of Iskor books, what I and my colleagues here are doing, of this Jewish communities since the Middle Ages, that were recording the names of the Jews that died in pogroms and were reading them aloud every year in the synagogue to never forget. And maybe the last thing I want to say, if I'm thinking about Israel and what Israel should do to really honor these victims and these families, in my mind, it's only elections.
Our time is very short, friends, but I wanted to just, if we could, just spend a
Vote
moment
for that.
casting our gaze forward. Amir, you conclude your book by visiting an apartment building in Bat Yam, where many of the older members of your kibbutz, some of them the founding generation, have now moved. And I'm wondering what your sense is of the future for Nachal Oz. Will the people return, and will that kibbutz carry on?
Most of my neighbors want to return to our home. I want to return to my home. My family wants to return. But something very important needs to happen for us to return. We need to get back our friends who are still in Gaza, in a tunnel held by Hamas. And it's very important that we are discussing memory, because we lost so many people on the day. And I write in my book about the people we lost. But there are people we can still save. Tzachi and Omri, my neighbors, were kidnapped in front of their families on October 7th. And I describe in the book how it happened. And we can still bring them back alive. For all we know, they are alive somewhere there in a tunnel, waiting to be saved. The only way we can save them is make a deal. We've so far, in almost a month of war, rescued 8 hostages and killed in various ways many, many more. Some of them executed by Hamas when soldiers got close, others accidentally killed by our own fire. Some of them just died because the time and the conditions were too difficult. And this is critical for our ability to go back home. I can imagine myself returning to Nachal Oz, raising my daughters in a home that was attacked by terrorists, where a neighbor was killed in a house in front of me and another neighbor murdered in the house behind me. I can imagine taking my girls back there and raising them. But I cannot imagine taking my girls on a walk in the kibbutz and passing by Tzachi's house or Omri's house, knowing that we sacrificed them because of some political spin over the Philadelphia corridor. This, I think, would be my breaking point. And if we want a future for these communities, the first thing we have to do is to bring back the hostages.
I think that is the place we're going to leave it here tonight, friends. We are at the top of the hour, and I know there is obviously much more that we could say and much more that will be said in the weeks ahead and probably in the years ahead. But we're going to let it rest there for the evening. I am supremely grateful to you all. This is not an easy conversation to have, and it's not easy material to go through, but I'm grateful for your time and for your thoughts and for your willingness to be here. Amir Tibon is the author of The Gates of Gaza. Yaron is the author of 10-7, 100 Human Stories, and Ilan Troen, Israel, Palestine, and World Religions, Whose Promised Land. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our audience tonight. Thank you to 70 Faces Media and Thea and JTA, and we'll see you next time. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.